3 stories today that quietly reveal where gaming is heading. A PS6 handheld leak that could change how PlayStation works. A heated PC versus console debate over Monster 5090 builds. And The Witcher 4 pushing path tracing technology further than we've seen in open-world RPGs. 3 different conversations. But they all point to the same thing. The next generation of gaming is already starting. Here are the biggest gaming leaks and news you've probably missed this week. What makes this whole PS6 handheld rumor so interesting is that it does not sound like Sony is just messing around with another side gadget. This sounds way bigger than that, way more serious. Because if these leaks are even halfway accurate, then Sony is not building another glorified streaming screen like the PlayStation Portal. They are apparently aiming for a real handheld, a native machine, something that can actually run PS5 and even PS6 style games on its own. And honestly, that changes the entire conversation, because for years, people kept asking the same question. Is Sony ever going to properly return to handheld gaming? Not with a cute accessory, not with remote play branding, not with a niche experiment, but with an actual machine you can hold in your hands, take anywhere, and boot up real games on. And now suddenly, this Canis codename keeps popping up, tied to the same general launch window as the PlayStation 6, somewhere around holiday 2027. That alone is enough to get people talking. But then you start looking at the rumored specs and the bigger picture, and now this thing starts sounding less like fan fiction and more like Sony trying to set up a full ecosystem play. Because think about it, if this handheld is native, non-streaming, and designed to run PS5 and PS6 games in some form, then Sony is not just making a companion device. They are potentially building a hybrid future, a machine that sits somewhere between a traditional portable and a dockable home console experience. Basically, their answer to the question Nintendo has owned for years, which is, what if one device could do both? And that is where this gets spicy. The rumor says this thing could use AMD RDNA5 graphics, around 16 compute units, LPDDR5X memory, AI upscaling, and a 3nm chip. Now, obviously, we have to say it. None of this is official. Sony has not announced this thing. These are leaks, whispers, and industry chatter. But if those details are remotely in the ballpark, then Sony is not aiming low here. They are not trying to make a weak little novelty handheld that struggles to breathe the moment a modern game shows up. They seem to be aiming for something that actually matters. And that matters a lot, because handheld gaming in 2026 is not what it used to be. We are not living in the old PSP or Vita days anymore, where people were impressed just because a game looked pretty good for a handheld. No, the standard is much higher now. Players have seen what the Steam Deck can do. They have seen portable PCs brute force modern games. They have seen Nintendo dominate the hybrid concept, even with weaker hardware, because the convenience is just that strong. So if Sony really is stepping back into this market, they know they cannot show up half asleep. They cannot release another device that feels like a side project. That is why the native part of this rumor is the real headline, not the codename, not the render, not even the release window. The real headline is that this thing is allegedly built to run games locally. Because if that is true, then Sony understands exactly what people were disappointed by with the Portal. The Portal is fine for what it is, but let's be honest, a lot of people looked at it and thought, that's it? It felt like Sony testing the waters without fully committing. But a native handheld, a real machine, that is commitment. That is Sony saying, all right, enough with the warm-up. Here's the actual move. And the timing would make sense too. Launching it around the same window as PS6 would be a very Sony thing to do if they want to create one unified platform family. Imagine the messaging. Buy into next-gen PlayStation. And now you are not just getting a console under the TV. You are getting a broader ecosystem, a home machine, and a portable extension of that same world. Shared architecture, shared game development targets, shared branding, shared services, shared account ecosystem, maybe shared cloud saves, performance profiles, cross-buy incentives, maybe even handheld-aware design philosophies in future first-party games. That is not just a new product. That is platform expansion. Now, of course, there is one thing that makes people nervous, and it should. If developers have to account for a lower power handheld in the same ecosystem, does that hold back PS6 games? Does that mean next-gen titles need to be designed around weaker hardware constraints? That is a real concern, because the second people hear portable version, they start imagining compromised game design, cut down ambition, and another generation where developers are forced to scale around the weakest link. But here is the thing, that depends entirely on how Sony handles it. If Sony treats the handheld like a flexible target with intelligent scaling, dynamic resolution, resolutions, AI reconstruction, lower settings, and smart optimization, then this could work beautifully. PC games already do this every day. The same game can run on wildly different hardware if the engine is built properly. The issue is not whether lower-powered hardware exists. The issue is whether the platform holder gives developers the right tools and realistic expectations. And if this rumor about AI upscaling is true, then that may be Sony's way of closing the gap, because that is the trick now, right? Raw horsepower alone is not the whole game anymore. Everybody is chasing smarter rendering, reconstruction, machine learning tricks, and better efficiency. If Sony can push a handheld with a strong architecture, decent memory bandwidth, and modern upscaling tech, then suddenly a lot of impossible games become possible enough. Not at max settings, not in crazy native 4K nonsense, but in a very playable, very impressive handheld form. And let's be real, that is all it needs to be. Nobody sane is expecting a handheld to outperform a full PS6 console sitting under a TV with way more thermal headroom and power budget. That would be ridiculous. What people want is believable portability. They want a device that feels premium, runs real games, and does not feel obsolete on day one. That is the bar. And if Sony can hit that bar, this thing could be huge. What also adds fuel to the conversation is the release timing drama. You have one side saying maybe the next PlayStation gets pushed to 2028 or even 2029 because of memory supply issues. Then you have leakers like Kepler L2 saying no, Sony and Microsoft are still aiming for roughly the same window for PS6, the handheld, and Project Helix. Then Moore's Law is Dead also comes in with the idea that Sony probably does not want to drag this out too far, because delaying a new generation too much can actually create its own problems. And honestly, that makes sense. At some point, waiting becomes expensive too. Momentum matters. Market timing matters. Consumer excitement matters. So when you line all that up, you can kind of see why people are paying attention to this rumor. It is not just, oh cool, maybe Sony makes a handheld. No, it is bigger than that. This could be Sony trying to reshape what PlayStation means in the next generation. Not just a box, not just a premium console, a full hardware family, a device for the living room, a device for portable play, and maybe a future where your PlayStation library travels with you in a much more meaningful way. And if they pull that off, that is dangerous. Dangerous for competitors, dangerous for anyone who thought Sony would just play it safe, and especially dangerous if Microsoft is still figuring out what its own hardware future really looks like. Because Sony entering next gen with a strong console and a serious handheld at the same time could be one hell of a flex. Still, we have to stay grounded. These are rumors. Exciting rumors, yes. Very juicy rumors. But rumors. Sony has not confirmed the Canis handheld. Sony has not confirmed the specs. Sony has not confirmed the timing. So nobody should be acting like this thing is already sitting on store shelves. But as a concept, as a strategy, as a possible look at where PlayStation is heading, yeah, this is the kind of rumor that gets people fired up for a reason. You know what's funny about this whole comment section debate? On the surface, it looks like the same old internet argument we've all seen 1,000 times. Someone flexes a monster PC build, someone else defends consoles, a few ego jabs fly across the room, a couple of sarcastic replies, the usual YouTube comment section gladiator arena. But if you zoom out for a second, the conversation underneath is actually pretty interesting. You've got one guy talking about his 50, 90, pushing, path-traced games at 200 plus frames on a super ultra-wide monitor. And yeah, that is insane. No reasonable person would look at that setup and say, meh, that GPU is a spaceship strapped to a motherboard. It's like bringing a Formula 1 car to a go-kart track. Of course, it's going to look ridiculous. The problem starts when that performance turns into a measuring contest. Suddenly, the argument becomes, look how powerful my PC is compared to a console. And at that point, the conversation kind of misses the entire point of why consoles exist in the first place. PC gaming and console gaming have never been competing in the same race. A high-end gaming PC is like a custom-built race car. Every part can be swapped, upgraded, tuned, pushed to the limit. You want ridiculous frame rates, path tracing, ultra-wide monitors that look like airplane cockpits? Go for it. If your wallet survives the experience, the sky's the limit. Consoles live in a completely different world. They're closer to something like a high-performance sports car that rolls out of the factory already tuned. You don't open the hood every weekend trying to squeeze out another 2 32 frames per second. You turn the key and it just works. Same road, different philosophy. That's why every generation you see the same cycle play out. A new console launches and PC enthusiasts say, my hardware already crushes that. And they're right. Of course it does. A $3,000 GPU will beat a console chip every time. But the real magic of consoles shows up later, once developers start squeezing that hardware like a lemon at a margarita stand. Fixed hardware lets studios optimize in ways PC games often can't. Suddenly, that modest console chip is running games that look way better than anyone expected on paper. It's been happening since the PS2 days. Now throw the handheld rumor into the mix and the whole conversation gets even more interesting. This so-called Canis device people keep talking about isn't trying to beat a 5090 at raw power. That would be like trying to put a jet engine in a skateboard. Completely pointless. What Sony seems to be exploring instead is flexibility. Imagine a future PlayStation ecosystem where your main console sits under the TV, pushing the heavy visuals, while a portable device lets you take those same games on the road. Maybe not at the exact same visual settings, but still running them locally. That idea is powerful in a totally different way. Nintendo figured that out years ago with the Switch. That machine is basically the gaming equivalent of a small hatchback with a surprisingly strong engine. Not the fastest thing on the highway, yet it somehow ended up dominating traffic anyway. Convenience wins a lot of battles. Sony entering that space with modern AMD architecture and AI upscaling tricks could create something pretty compelling. A device that isn't trying to beat a monster gaming PC, but instead trying to make gaming fit into more moments of your life. The couch, the bed, a plane, a train, a lazy Sunday where you don't feel like turning on the TV. Now suddenly the discussion isn't about who has the bigger GPU anymore. It becomes about the overall experience. And here's the funny part about the whole 5090 Flex argument. By the time the PlayStation 6 actually launches, that card will already be a few years old. The PC world moves like a treadmill that never stops speeding up. New GPUs will exist. New architecture will show up. Someone will always have something faster. That's the nature of that ecosystem. Consoles play a slower, steadier game. A new generation lands, the hardware stays consistent, and developers spend the next several years mastering it. Different strategy, different rhythm. So when someone says, my PC destroys what the PS6 will do, the real answer is, sure, that was never the point. The interesting question is something else entirely. What kind of gaming experience will people actually want in 2027? A gigantic tower that sounds like a jet engine preparing for takeoff? Or a powerful console paired with a handheld that lets you play the same ecosystem anywhere? One approach chases maximum horsepower. The other tries to make gaming fit into everyday life. And if Sony really pulls off that handheld idea alongside the PS6, that's not just another console launch. That's a chess move. Now let's talk about something that is quietly becoming one of the weirdest modern gaming debates: physical games. And the situation around is a perfect example of the strange place the industry is in right now. Because on paper, the game is getting a full physical release on PlayStation 5. You can walk into a store, grab the box, pop the disc in your console, and install it like the good old days. Except not quite. What players have discovered from early copies floating around is that the disc doesn't actually contain the full playable game. You'll still need to connect to the internet and download the day one patch before you can even start playing. Now, to be clear, once that update is installed, you can play offline just fine. No constant online check-in. No server handshake every time you launch the game. After that first download, you're good. But the key issue is simple. Without the internet, the disc alone won't run the game. And that's where things start rubbing some players the wrong way. Because the whole point of buying a physical copy for a lot of people is preservation. It's the idea that you actually own something tangible, a disc that contains the full experience, something you could theoretically pop into a console 10 or 20 years from now and still play. That's been the philosophy behind physical media since the PlayStation 1 era. But modern game sizes have turned that idea into a bit of a logistical headache. See, the numbers tell the story here. The install images floating around show roughly 76 gigabytes being copied from the disc. Meanwhile, the full PC version of the game is expected to land somewhere around 150 gigabytes. That's a massive difference. And the likelihood likely reason is pretty simple. Probably chose to ship the game on a single Blu-ray disc instead of using two, which means half the game still has to arrive through a download. Now, from a production standpoint, that decision actually makes sense. Shipping multiple discs increases manufacturing costs, packaging complexity, and distribution headaches. But from a player perspective, it creates this strange hybrid situation. You technically bought a physical copy, yet the game still depends on a digital download to function. It's kind of like buying a hardcover book and discovering the last 10 chapters are waiting for you on a website. You still own the book. It just feels incomplete. And here's where things get even more interesting. According to the technical reports floating around, that day, one patch might not just contain the missing data. It's also expected to include major upgrades, including support for Sony's PSSR upscaling on PS5 Pro, which means the version on the disc may not represent the final intended experience anyway. In other words, the download is doing double duty, finishing the game installation and updating the technology stack at the same time. Now, depending on how you look at it, this whole situation falls somewhere between two extremes. On one side, you have preservation purists who absolutely hate this trend. For them, a physical release that can't run without a download defeats the entire purpose of physical media. On the other side, you have players who simply don't care. For most people today, downloading an update before playing a game is just normal life. They'll connect the console, grab the patch, and jump into the adventure without giving it a second thought. Two very different philosophies. One sees discs as permanent artifacts. The other sees them more like installation key. And the truth is, the industry has been drifting toward that second model for years now. Modern games are enormous. Updates are constant. Optimization patches, performance tweaks, graphical improvements, bug fixes, new features. The software rarely stays frozen in time the way older disc-based games did. That doesn't mean the physical format is dead, far from it. A lot of players still prefer owning a box, collecting games, trading them, lending them to friends. But situations like this show how the definition of physical copy is slowly changing. The disc is becoming more like the front door. The rest of the house still lives online. And Crimson Desert just happens to be the latest example of that reality colliding with old school expectations. Now the real question becomes something bigger. Is this just a temporary compromise while games keep getting larger? Or is this the future of physical media altogether? Because if game sizes keep growing the way they are, we might eventually reach a point where discs are basically just fancy license tokens. And that's a conversation the industry hasn't fully figured out yet. Let's talk about something that actually gets the graphics nerds sweating a little. The Witcher 4! CD Projekt Red has now confirmed that the game will support path tracing on PC, and not just the basic version we've seen patched into older games. They're working closely with Epic Games and NVIDIA to push it much further, and this is where things start getting really interesting. Because according to CDPR rendering engineer Cesare Bella, the studio is collaborating directly with Epic and NVIDIA to streamline how path tracing works inside Unreal Engine. That alone tells you something important. They are not simply flipping a graphical toggle at the end of development. This lighting system is being baked into the foundation of the game. Think of it like building a house. Some games build the house first, and then install nicer lights later. What CDPR seems to be doing is wiring the entire building around those lights from day one. That usually leads to much better results. Now, the second part of this announcement is the real technical spice. The Witcher 4 will also take advantage of NVIDIA's RTX Mega Geometry. If that name sounds like something a transformer would yell before throwing a punch, the concept is actually pretty cool. One of the biggest problems with path tracing in open-world games is geometry. Huge environments, massive forests, thousands of objects constantly updating as the player moves around. Traditional rendering pipelines start choking when scenes get that complex. It's like trying to organize a library where the books are constantly teleporting to different shelves. RTX Mega Geometry is supposed to fix that problem. According to NVIDIA, the system can handle massive scenes and update them up to 100 times faster than older methods. That means developers can keep enormous amounts of detail in the world without the renderer collapsing into a slideshow, and that matters a lot for a Witcher game. This is not a hallway shooter. It's forests, mountains, villages, swamps, monsters, weather systems, foliage everywhere. If path tracing is going to work in that kind of environment, the engine needs to juggle a ridiculous amount of information at once. That's where this new level of detail system comes in. RTX Mega Geometry introduces smarter ways to handle things like foliage. Instead of updating scanning every single leaf and plant constantly, the system selectively updates the parts of the scene that actually need attention. Less wasted memory, faster updates, smoother performance. Picture a stage crew behind a theater play. They don't rebuild the entire set every time the actor walks across the stage. They adjust what the audience can see in that moment. Same idea. The end goal here is something developers have been chasing for years. Fully path-traced environments with dense vegetation, animated objects, accurate lighting, and dynamic shadows, all happening in real time. If it works the way NVIDIA is promising, forests in games could start behaving like real lighting environments instead of giant collections of glowing cardboard trees. Now here's another interesting detail. The Witcher 4 is being built on Unreal Engine 5 using Lumen and Nanite, but CDPR has already hinted that the game should run far better than many UE5 titles we've seen so far. And let's be honest, that statement probably raised a few eyebrows, because Unreal Engine 5 games have developed a bit of a reputation lately. Gorgeous visuals, sure, but performance that sometimes feels like your GPU just ran a marathon while carrying groceries. CDPR seems very aware of that. The studio has already talked about building better optimization pipelines with Epic. Less of the ship it and pray the patches fix it later approach. More focus on getting the engine behaving properly from the start. If they actually pull that off, it could become one of the best examples of what Unreal Engine 5 is capable of when the tech is handled carefully. Now let's move to the story side for a second. The Witcher 4 will shift the spotlight to Ciri, and this is not the Ciri we knew from Witcher 3, the girl constantly on the run from cosmic threats. This version of Ciri is supposed to be a fully mutated Witcher, stepping into her own role as a monster hunter. That alone opens up a lot of narrative possibilities. Geralt's story was always about a man who had already lived 1,000 battles. Ciri's story could feel very different. Younger, more volatile, more personal. A Witcher still figuring out what kind of legend she wants to become. Meanwhile, the world itself is heading into darker territory again. Old forces rising, past choices catching up with people. The usual Witcher recipe where every moral decision feels like stepping into quicksand. And somewhere inside that brutal world, CD Projekt Red is trying to build one of the most technologically ambitious environments we've seen. Let's switch gears for a second, because every once in a while, the gaming industry actually does something nice. Shocking, I know. Right now, players are talking about, and not because of drama, layoffs, or another publisher trying to sneak a $40 expansion pass into your wallet. The conversation is happening for the opposite reason. Sucker Punch just dropped the Legends multiplayer update, and the wild part is not that it exists. The wild part is the price tag. $0. Free. And the scale of this thing has people genuinely confused, not angry confused. The other kind. The kind where players download the update and go, wait a minute, are we sure someone didn't accidentally forget to charge us? Because in the current gaming climate, this kind of update almost feels like a time machine. You boot up the game expecting a small multiplayer add-on, maybe a couple missions, maybe a small co-op mode, something that keeps people busy for a few hours. Instead, what players are getting is multiple modes, cosmetics, progression systems, and enough content that some people are literally saying this could have been its own separate game. And here's the hilarious part. Nobody would have questioned it if they charged for it. If a publisher came out tomorrow and said, new multiplayer expansion, $30, people would probably shrug and say, yeah, sounds about right. That's the market now. Live service battle passes, cosmetic bundles that cost more than lunch, season passes stacked on top of expansions, stacked on top of premium currency. The modern gaming store page sometimes looks less like a game and more like the snack aisle at a movie theater. Went in for popcorn. You walked out with a $47 combo. So when something like this lands, it hits differently. Players notice. One fan on social media basically summed it up perfectly. If we criticize companies when they mess things up, we should also give them credit when they do something right. That shouldn't be a controversial statement, yet somehow it feels rare. And this isn't even the first time it's pulled this move. Veterans might remember the Legends mode in Same Story. Huge multiplayer update, new gameplay structure, co-op missions, survival modes, progression, and again, free. No premium pack, no starter bundle, just a big chunk of extra game. Think of it like ordering a burger and fries, and halfway through the meal, the chef walks out and drops a milkshake on your table. You didn't ask for it, you didn't pay for it, but there it is. And suddenly the restaurant looks a lot better than the one next door charging $4 for ketchup. Now, there is a bigger industry angle hiding behind this story. The gaming world right now is constantly arguing about monetization, DLC prices, subscription fatigue, battle passes, microtransactions sneaking into places where they don't belong. Players are tired of feeling like every feature has a price tag tag attached to it. So when a studio delivers something big without reaching for the credit card machine, it feels refreshing. Not revolutionary, just refreshing. Like opening a window in a room that's been full of smoke for a while. Now, let's also be fair here. Sucker Punch isn't doing charity work. This kind of goodwill has real benefits. Happy players talk about the game more. The community stays active longer. Word of mouth spreads. That reputation becomes incredibly valuable over time. Studios that treat players well tend to build loyal fan bases, and loyal fan bases show up when the next game launches. Funny how that works. Treat people fairly, and they actually want to support you. Who would have guessed? If you enjoyed this video, hey, maybe drop a like. It really helps a lot and tells me you want more. Subscribe for day one gaming leaks and news, and check out these videos you probably missed. Trust me, they're worth it.